we have with us today Brian Knappenberger and James Wright. I don't know how many of you saw the film that was shown in this hall just before this session, Nobody Speak. This is a film made by Brian Knappenberger, and James Wright did an expose on the newspaper Las Vegas Review-Journal and the taking over of that newspaper by a casino mogul called Sheldon Adelson. If you saw the film, you saw how it happened, and we'll talk about that in detail. James is an American screenwriter, author, and journalist, best known for his role in what I just spoke to you about, his investigation in the secret purchase of the Las Vegas Review-Journal. He is a senior editor with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, based in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is the recipient of numerous reports for investigative journalism. Brian Knappenberger, on my left, is an award-winning documentary filmmaker known for The Internet's Own Boy, Aaron Swartz. That was a devastating film. I don't know how many of you have seen it. I do suggest that you take the time out to watch it. It is, you think things happen in India, watch that. I don't know if that's not reassuring, but bad things happen everywhere. We Are Legion, the story of hacktivists, was, I think, almost a cult film, which a lot of people saw, and his work on the Bloomberg Game Changers. The documentary film We Are Legion was written and directed by Brian, and it is about the workings and beliefs of the self-described hacktivist collective Anonymous. Now, he's here to talk to us about the film that I hope most of you have seen, Nobody Speak. This film is about Peter Thiel successfully closing down Gawker.com, a website that had had outed him when he was not public about his being gay, and they exposed him, and he waited almost 12 years, biding his time, looking for an opportunity on how he could bring them down. And he successfully did. The film is about that, as well as what James exposed with Adelson. So we start with how did you, just for the basics to get that out of the way, how did you think of making this film? Why did you want to make it? Obviously, it's an important film related to the First Amendment, which is sacred in America. I wish it was here, but can you explain why did you choose to make the film?
Well, for me, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here at the Media Room.
Welcome.
I started making this film, I first started getting interested in the story when this very bizarre and kind of salacious trial was going on in Florida between Hulk Hogan and Gawker Media. Gawker Media is a publication that is more on the sort of tabloid side of things. And they had, and I'm sure you've seen the film, so I won't go over the whole story, but there was this battle going on based on this sex tape from Hulk Hogan. And whether
just in case, can I just fill them in a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, Hulk Hogan is this cult figure, like a wrestler, and Hulk Hogan has a persona that he claims is very different from his private persona. And the persona that he's created of Hulk Hogan is, he says, all-American, and he's, waves the flag and is very aggressive. And he, incidentally, has also been on a reality show. So I would like to ask you also further that where does he come asking about privacy when his whole life his marriage was coming apart in public on a reality show? But please first finish what you were saying.
Yeah, that's I think an interesting part of it. He's a public figure, which is an important part of the story too. But this battle, he took issue with Gawker. Gawker had published part of this sex tape and written a big article about it, and so the battle was taking place in this Florida courtroom, which I thought was just really fascinating and was testing the boundaries of the First Amendment in the United States. So I was paying a lot of attention to that, but. And by the way, I had some sympathy for Hogan's case. And then it was revealed after the trial. We had started sort of filming, thinking about making a film. And then it was revealed after the trial that this figure, Peter Thiel, who is a billionaire, one of the first outside investors of Facebook, Silicon Valley icon, really. Well, it was revealed that after the verdict was $140 million to Hulk Hogan. And that, combined with a law in Florida, the state of Florida, that required Gawker to pay $50 million right away, was effectively the end of Gawker. It had silenced Gawker. It stopped publishing, and it has never resumed publishing. So Gawker was kind of wiped off the scene. And then it was revealed that that Peter Thiel had funded Hulk Hogan's lawsuit in secret. And that became a very different story for me. Then I started thinking a lot more about how billionaires could influence and publications that they didn't like, whatever you think of Gawker, that there were billionaires could wield their money in order to silence news organizations that said things that they didn't like. And so that's when the film really started for me. And it was particularly the secretive aspect of that that got me interested in the film. And then I thought there was a similar secretive aspect to the Las Vegas Review-Journal story when Sheldon Adelson came in secret bought the paper, presumably to use it for, it was important to know who had owned the paper, and so I was interested in telling the story.
So the second part of the film is related to James's work, in which we see that this casino owner secretly buys Sheldon Adelson, and you see the confrontation between the reporters who want to know who they're working for. James, would you like to tell the story of how you came about the story and why you wanted to expose it? Because in India, we're pretty used to news organizations being bought up, and you don't know who you're working for till the last minute sometimes.
Well, all news organizations have an owner. That goes with the territory. It's unusual in the United States, though, for the owner to be secret, to not know who it is. And the paper had been purchased. People were very upset, and the new owner sent a front man to address the staff and was asked, well, who are the owners? And he said, you don't need to know, just do your job. That's like throwing red meat in front of lions. You don't say things like that to journalists. So we went on a mission to name our owner before anyone else could. It was a competitive story on top of everything else. At first I thought that this was something that only journalists would really care about. But like in a lot of newsrooms, we have a big board, a big television screen that shows our online viewership. And it was phenomenal. The day we published the story, which was done over the objections, or at least without the approval of the publisher, the storyline went like this. Page views, like that. It went from almost nothing to 500,000 instantly based on that one story. That told us that people cared about who owned the paper. And that was gratifying, actually. We then followed that up with another story that said that Mr. Adelson, with the help of the prior owners during the time after he had agreed to buy it, before he took over and it was announced that we had a new owner, had already tried to use the staff to embarrass a sitting judge who was ruling on a court case in a way he didn't like. Which brought home the same thing, same kind of response. Everyone really flocked to that story. And that really brought home the reason why it's important to know who the owner is and what anonymous ownership of a news organization can mean. It means it can be abused and used to produce propaganda, to report only what they want, or to protect themselves from scrutiny.
There is a statement given in your film by a lawyer who says that he's a First Amendment attorney, and he says that the government cannot pick and choose what is permissible. Even the most disagreeable speech is fully protected by the First Amendment. We do have freedom of speech in our Constitution, but we also have amendments. and those amendments then qualify our freedom of speech if they cross the line in terms of if they're incendiary, if they create a riot, if they offend anyone, and someone is always being offended in India. So I think there should be a ministry for people with sensitive feelings and taking offense, but that is going on constantly. So your freedom of speech amendment is absolute. But in this case, they took privacy, the judge took privacy as being more important than the First Amendment.
Yes.
Also, I just need to tell them about what was shown. Gawker.com showed a home video that was taken unknown to Hulk Hogan by his friend whose wife he was sleeping with. So that was the sex tape that was shown on Gawker.com.
The First Amendment in the United States does have some boundaries. You can't libel somebody. There are laws against that. You're perfectly allowed to offend people. So the Ministry of Offense. Let's hope we don't get to that. What's supposed to be the case is that if the statement is true, then you're protected. That if what you're doing and what you're finding out about somebody is a true statement, then you're protected. This is a kind of a protection and there is no just because something is offensive, even offensive speech that I don't like, a speech that a lot of people don't like, is protected speech. And so we do have a tradition of that in the United States that is very important. In this case, it was a jury trial, it wasn't the judge, but it was a jury trial. It was a hometown jury, by the way. It was Hulk Hogan's hometown. So I think and he was a celebrity, so I think that probably played into it to some degree. But there is the issue of privacy, which is one of the things that drew me to the story in the first place. What are the boundaries there? How far does this get pushed? And so, what they ultimately decided that it was that Gawker crossed the line. I know that Gawker and the people that ran Gawker, Nick Denton and the others that own Gawker, the lawyers, really believed that they would be able to overturn this on appeal. So they were able to, in the United States, you have the opportunity to argue your case in an appellate court, and they believed that this would be overturned, and they never got that chance because they were forced to put up $50 million right away. That basically caused instant bankruptcy and forced them to have to try to sell the paper. So it was a series of events that actually put them out of business.
Mm-hmm. James, do you think it's important to publish anything regardless of whose privacy you encroach as an investigative journalist?
No, of course not. I mean, you have to weigh the public interest and the public good in this. I would argue that what Gawker did was not defensible. There was no public interest in a sex tape involving at that point, not fairly active wrestler. That was simply salacious on their part. I don't know why they did that, and I guess it was just for clicks online, but I would never do that.
I'm going to take a risk over here. I want to ask how many of you know the Hindi word for privacy? Please put your hands up. Not ekant, that's alone. Privacy. Yeah? I can't hear you. Just Nishita. Anyone else? Any other hands? So in the full hall, only you know it? Sorry? Yeah. So three people, as I can see, 3 people know it, right? What is the word? Both are correct, all right? So the majority of the people don't know the Hindi word for privacy because my contention is that we, in our culture, do not really value privacy, or we don't grow up with it. Our parents snoop on us. I know I snooped on my teenage children. Everybody's snooping on everybody else. The government is snooping on us. We accept it with a shrug. Very little protest against it. There is no actual law for privacy in India, as they have in the Constitution in America. So, and also you have to I raised the question to James and Brian that Edward Snowden gave up his life and is living in Russia in order to inform the American people that you are being spied on. That's a big issue. In India, I can't see any Indian flying to Russia, giving up his life to inform the Indian people that you're being spied on, because the Indian people would simply say, we know, and we don't care. Am I wrong in this? Just put up your hands if you disagree. Okay, so then we'll come to the questions later. Brian, why is privacy that important? I mean, here people walk into bedrooms without knocking.
Yeah.
You have to, a cousin is sent with a honeymooning couple that you go along to take care of them. All kinds, there's complete encroach. A mother-in-law will sit on the bed of the newlywed couple and they wait, rolling their eyes like, when is she going to leave? All this happens. And one of the toughest things in India is to be alone, because everybody, oh, poor person, you're sitting alone. That's pathetic, because you can't be alone. There's always company, there's no privacy, everybody wants to know every thought of yours. Yeah. But in the American culture, this issue, which is part of this case, can you explain to us why is privacy so important when we're quite happy without it?
Yeah, that's so interesting. A really good friend of mine in Los Angeles, her family lives here, so I went out to dinner with them last night, so I got a pretty good dose of what you're talking about. I think privacy is one of the big issues of our time, actually. As more of us move online, these questions are coming up in the United States. The Constitution of the United States, specifically the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, protects us against illegal searches and seizures from the government. So it says the government is not allowed to come search your, the way it's phrased is papers, artifacts, and papers and artifacts without a warrant. So you have to go to the government has to go to a judge, an independent, the judiciary, and say, can we get a warrant to search this person's
Interesting that you bring that
facts.
up, because our parliament has just passed a bill where the income tax people can march in without a warrant.
Yeah.
And take you into custody without a warrant.
Yeah, that's right on the nose, illegal in the United States. And this is the government. This is a law that restricts the government's use potential. So what Edward Snowden did basically is he said, look, the government is conducting these dragnet surveillance of American citizens, specifically after 9/11. In order to and recording and there's some argument about what they were doing, but this kind of mass suspicionless surveillance of American citizens in order to find the kind of needle in the haystack of crime or terrorism. And his point was, and a lot of people have pointed this out, that this may be a modern way of knocking down somebody's door and looking at their papers and artifacts, but this is the same thing, and this is unconstitutional. So that's a debate we're having now. That's with regard to government. Surveillance of citizens. That's the restriction. We also are in a time in which we voluntarily give up a lot of our personal and private information to social media and other things. And by the way, the government is allowed to buy that stuff. So this is I think we're entering into a time where we've just never had this much of our own private information online, and that information has never been so vulnerable. Hardly a week goes by in the United States where we don't hear big stories about people, corporations that have some of our private data getting hacked and that data getting leaked. So I think this is the issue of privacy in general is one of the big issues of our time. What is our personal information? Where does that boundary end? I think in the United States it's pretty clear where that boundary is when it comes to the government. The government is not allowed to do this without a warrant, and that's the big discussion, the Edward Snowden discussion. But as for private companies, how far can they go with collecting our private data?
Well, there's a new book out called Capitalism, Surveillance Capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think the large companies, anywhere you might be online, are snooping on us in far greater detail than the government is. Yeah. James, how do you feel in terms of, you're an investigative journalist, and in terms of where the government is, you working in East European, what used to be called East European countries, how do you function over there? Is the government also surveying people? The companies also collecting data? Is that how it is?
Well, we benefit from leaks of data, and some of it is private data. we would never, for example, the Panama Papers, my organization had a hand in sorting those out. We would never simply invade someone's privacy, take a private citizen doing nothing illegal and hold up their finances or their private affairs just for the titillation factor. It has to be something where it has a public good, or there's a reason to do it, or there's been a crime committed that's not being addressed. That's the difference. There are reasons to look into someone's private life, but only if there's a public reason to do it.
What kind of fallout did you get from the government or the public or from Silicon Valley about your film? How did Silicon Valley, I mean, there couldn't be one reaction, but what was the general reaction of people over there?
Well, I think our film was a little early on. There was no. First of all, there was no legal reaction. We didn't get sued or anything for the film, which I was half expecting, and we were kind of prepared for.
Did you have lawyers look at it to make sure?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, we do that with all of our work, but and we make sure that we're doing things right. We fact check everything, multiple sources. We really sort of tear a piece apart to make sure that what we're presenting is real. But I think that in general, since the film, I'm not saying because of the film, but we were a little early on this sort of trend, but that a lot of people in Silicon Valley are questioning the reach of Silicon Valley. And there's been backlash within Facebook, within Google. There's been lots of people talking about whether the reach of these organizations is as good as they sort of typically and traditionally thought it would be. Silicon Valley has always been held up as the big entrepreneurial great sort of force. But a lot of people are questioning like what's happening with this data. What role did they play in the United States 2016 election? How did they deal with Russian interference in that election and on their platforms, manipulation of their platforms? There's all sorts of issues now questioning about hate speech and the degree to which hate speech should be allowed on these platforms, the way that people are bullied a lot of times on these platforms. There seems to be a trend now of people that are working in tech questioning it, which is new to me. Which is, I think Silicon Valley has always been this great shining star of the United States economy, and now there's a real, genuine questioning of that. So, I'm not saying the film caused that, but I think that has been a trend in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's been around the world actually, and how people are reacting to social media and the giants, basically. James, what is the atmosphere like in where you work in Sarajevo in terms of kind of investigative work that you do that questions the powerful?
The atmosphere?
Meaning, how do you get? Are you safe? Maybe. Maybe not.
A reporter working with OCCRP was it last year, was murdered in Slovakia. Journalists do get harassed. They occasionally do get killed for doing the work that we do. I don't see that dampening anyone's enthusiasm to do the work. It just makes us that much more careful. We work with journalists from all across Eastern Europe, North Africa, South America now, into the Middle East, and the conditions are different in every country. And in some countries, if someone is even known to be a journalist, it can endanger their life or endanger the livelihood of their families. In some parts of the world, if you are identified as a journalist, they'll simply jail your family and prevent even distant relatives from having jobs. So we have many people who actually are not able to work under their own names or work in their own countries. As an American journalist, we think we're tough and we're doing stuff and we're out there turning over rocks. We don't know anything about what it's like to work in some countries where, like India, your life could be on the line at any moment.
Well, you have an advantage there that you really have not seen journalists being poisoned or jailed, except for a few who stood up for keeping their sources intact. But what are the challenges you face in terms of putting out a story that you know will not be popular. I mean, Aaron Swartz is, how do you say his name? Aaron Swartz, yeah. That was, I think, a very difficult film to make, I would imagine. Quite traumatic to watch. What were the challenges you faced when you made that film?
Well, that was, if you don't know, Aaron Swartz was a sort of advocate of online freedoms. He was a coder. He was one of the original founders of Reddit. He had gotten involved in government and grassroots organizing for mostly internet freedom issues and First Amendment issues, and he had run afoul of the law for reasons that you can watch the film and kind of see it play out. But he sadly took his own life after really years of battling the government over charges that I think he probably shouldn't have even been, certainly are not reached the level of felonies and the level of...
I wouldn't even say that he sort of ran afoul of the law. He broke codes. He went into Harvard. He made information that you had to pay for. He made it freely available.
Yeah.
That's basically what he did,
yeah.
And he was hounded for that.
Right. Yeah. His main one of the things that got him in trouble is that he was upset that academically funded research, that research that was funded by taxpayers, was given sometimes to these private companies, these private organizations,
who then marketed it.
And then they marketed it and made a lot of money, and a lot of people couldn't access it, just didn't have the money, because sometimes some of these organizations, like JSTOR, it was expensive to access money that actually the taxpayers had paid for. So he felt this was hindrance to scientific research and knowledge and all sorts of, just a problem in general. So he actually downloaded, I forget the number, but a huge amount of this information. He never published it. He never did anything with it. People speculated what he might have done with it. He might have tried to leak it, but he didn't. He just downloaded it in a forum at MIT in which he had legal access to the database, and he was able to be online. So there's a lot of argument about how much he actually broke the law. But in any case, the authorities took it very, very seriously, and really threw the book at him, and he was facing some serious jail time. And during that process, he was just sort of overwrought by the hounding that he committed suicide. But he was, I think, by everybody's estimation, just a remarkable individual that had brought so many interesting innovations into the world.
He was a child prodigy.
He was a child
prodigy. That's how the film
yeah.
starts, where his mother takes him to places where there's a conference, and he's been talking to people who thought he was an adult.
Yeah.
They were talking to him online, and they thought this was a genius person who they're communicating with. When he shows up, and they can't believe that this is a kid.
Yeah.
And his mother's brought him. So it's a really remarkable film. I think one of the lessons in that is that there are so many versions of Kafkaesque stories in India, in America. You're telling me that in Sarajevo it's pretty similar, that you do face the same kind of tension and pressures from the government?
Yes, and not necessarily in Sarajevo. That's where the organization is headquartered. But we work across 20 or so different countries, 45 different centers, some of them with varying degrees of independence and association. And often we'll work with individual reporters from really anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world. But we don't really cover Bosnia so much. It just happens to be where we're located. But at the same time, we do face a lot of varying threats, and as an editor, I mostly work with reporters who are in different countries, and I have to be very cognizant that my sense of safety is far different than their sense of safety. They live in a place where their family is there, they don't perhaps have freedom of movement, they're reporting in a very hazardous situation. It's different than my situation.
Mm-hmm. In an interview to the New York Times, Peter Thiel said, Gawker has been a singularly terrible bully.
Sociopathic bully.
Yes. And he said, I think they should be described as terrorists, not as writers or reporters. I don't understand the psychology of people who would kill themselves and blow up buildings, and I don't understand people who would spend their lives being angry. Valleywag would go on to publish dozens of stories about Thiel and other high-profile figures in Silicon Valley. But he maintained that it was singularly the greatest philanthropic thing he's ever done. That's Peter Thiel.
It's a ridiculous statement. That's a ridiculous
Isn't
statement.
that a green light?
The singular most philanthropic thing he's ever done. That's pretty awful. I mean, he hasn't done much philanthropy.
To himself and his image, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, however angry Gawker is, that's protected. I think there is a discussion to be had, and one of the reasons I was interested in the film was this boundary, how far they had pushed the boundary. But the idea that they're a singularly sociopathic bully is just absurd. I mean, the United States comes from a tradition where there is lots of speech, and that speech you don't like should be countered with other speech.
But this was something, as just taking a devil's advocate point of view, this is something that he couldn't counter. If he was in the closet and didn't want to come out and say his parents or family or friends did not know and he did not want to come out, and Gawker.com outed him, there was no going back to counter it. He couldn't say, I'm straight. So that is a little, crossing the line, I would think.
Well, I think the issue of whether he's outed, do people know that story? So one of the reasons why that Peter Thiel gave for going after Gawker is that they had written an article about him. I think it was a 2008 article in which it was a typically kind of flippant title. It said, Peter Thiel is totally gay, people. But the article itself was actually pretty smart, to be honest. It basically said, look, and if you talk to Nick Denton, who is also gay, the founder of Gawker, his point would be, look, being gay is not something to be afraid of. This is his point.
He says it in the film also.
That if one of the most important investors in Silicon Valley is gay, if the CEO of Apple is gay, then young gay people should know that and have them as role models. I think the issue of outing people is delicate, and I think there is that has to be done with a great deal of concern. It is a private part of someone's life. It's what I think it touches on what James just said about when is someone's private information relevant. I think a lot of people would argue that if you are, if you're a powerful politician and you're passing anti-gay legislation, then maybe that's a relevant news article, news story. It's not unusual in the United States. Lots of tabloids have speculated as to the sexuality or sexual preference of different public figures. They've countered it. They've countered it in the public too. They've decided not to comment. So it's not, I think there's an open debate about whether that's appropriate or not, in which case it's appropriate. I mean, if you talk to Nick Denton or the person that wrote that article, they basically said, look, this guy should be a role model. It was actually a very positive article about Peter Thiel, and said if this important person is gay, people should know about that. It's no big deal. More power to him, basically, is the way they felt. You can have that argument about where that line is, but the idea that that's somehow outside the realm of protected First Amendment activity, or should be a reason that they don't exist, is kind of going too far.
But basically, he's not a politician. He's not elected in any office. He's not answerable to anyone as such.
He's not what?
He's not answerable to anyone as such. He doesn't owe voters an explanation of his behavior or his choice of sexuality or orientation. So Gawker coming out with, and Gawker's done other things, done other salacious stuff constantly, and it wasn't really a highly respected website, I would say, right?
Well, I think they were pushing the boundaries, trying to push the boundaries as much as they could. They broke a lot of stories. They broke a lot of stories. They were the first people to talk about Bill Cosby and the sort of years of sexual predation, basically, that he was engaged in. They were the first to do stories about Louis C.K. They broke stories about Scientology. There's a huge string of stories that they were actually pretty much out on front. But they also had this kind of darker, salacious side about celebrity and all that. So again, it's a tabloid culture. Where is the boundary of that? Peter Thiel is not a government official, but he's certainly a very powerful and a well-known figure in American society. So, that level of power, I think, puts him in a different category than a private citizen.
James, what do you think that in the film you can see that there is discomfort that a powerful billionaire can take down a website, even Gawker.com? Do you think that this is a green light to other people who are upset with what, say, a website or a news organization does? Do you think this encourages them?
Oh, very much so. I mean, this is a symbol to them that they can harass a website out of existence. Now, whether what Gawker did was right or wrong is one question. But we're now seeing this rise of the global elite, the number of billionaires who can file a lawsuit, even if they know that they will lose, but use it to drive people into bankruptcy who they don't like. We saw that with a columnist at the Review Journal who had been sued by Sheldon Adelson in the past before Adelson bought the newspaper and driven into bankruptcy over nothing. They ended up settling the lawsuit. It was dismissed in the journalist's favor, but the mere fact of having to fight it over the years drove him personally into bankruptcy, and the publisher of the book that the offensive passage appeared in was driven out of business. So even though it was not a valid lawsuit, it served the purpose of the billionaire who wanted to stifle the comment. That's becoming more and more common, where people are simply using their vast fortunes to really circumvent any sort of fairness. And they're the first ones to cry when they think that they've been wronged, but at the same time, they come down like a ton of bricks and decimate the field.
I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions.
My question is that I think all three of you are talking about two issues. One is whether a story is right or wrong, and the other is whether the story is illegal or libelous. And I think here I'd like you to comment on the fact, if you're aware of it, that the Indian libel law is to some extent based on the British libel law, where Seymour Hersh only had to give $1 to Morarji Desai for his allegation that there was a spy in the Indian cabinet. On the other hand, when Salman Rushdie was sued by Indira Gandhi, he had to delete an entire paragraph in his book. So I think the American libel law, please correct me if I'm wrong, implies that if you are a figure in the public domain, number one, it's difficult to be libeled. And number two, as you pointed out earlier, if the facts are correct, if it is true, if the man was gay, then what's his beef? What's the problem?
Yeah,
Actually,
I think
this
you
has
nailed it,
just
but
happened in court in India, where truth as a defense. There's a case that happened last week where for libel, and this is the first time that the judge has ruled that truth as a defense is acceptable. Please, Peter. I'm sorry.
No.
Excuse me, Brian.
I just gained $1 billion. I think you pointed it out. I mean, I think, yeah, the truth is supposed to be a protection against these things. It's also worth noting that, our President Trump, every few months very loudly proclaims we have to open up our libel laws and change libel laws in the United States to
First thing you have to do is move your kidney to your heart.
To what?
The first thing you have to do is move your kidney to your heart. The latest thing that Donald Trump has said after signing this bill for health care for the kidney, he says the kidney is the closest thing in your heart. I kid you not, he said this.
Okay.
It's on video.
Well, I missed that. You turn your head for 5 minutes and there's another 15 crazy things he said. But Jane, we were talking actually about your UK libel laws plays into your work.
You know, in Sarajevo, we tend to adhere more to the English libel law because most of what we write is going to end up affecting someone who has a business interest in England. It's far more restrictive than the U.S. libel law. You know, frankly, in the States, we have different categories of people. We have public officials. It's very hard to libel a public official. You can do it, but it's difficult. Then there are people like Hulk Hogan or Peter Thiel or the two of us who have thrust ourselves into the limelight, and we have lower protection against libel. You can be critical of us in a way that you couldn't just by picking someone out of the audience and being critical of them. So it's not a black and white, it's a little tricky, and this is why we pay lawyers way too much.
Wherever the hand is, yeah, there.
So I'm saying Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, Rupert Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal, and both papers have done some excellent reporting. Yeah. So this whole, this time when we keep talking about the media and, what's the future, and we say that there's some big philanthropist, so like Bezos comes in and buys the paper. What do you think, in going forward, is that something to be worried about, or is there good billionaire, bad billionaire kind of dichotomy?
That's a really good question. I know James has thought a lot about this, but and this has happened, by the way, in my own hometown in Los Angeles. The paper was just bought by a billionaire resident of our city. I think there's a couple things happening. First of all, it has always been the case that very rich people have owned news publications. I think it's what's really critical and what's, I think, egregious about the Sheldon Adelson example is that he tried to take that paper over in secret, so you don't know where he's coming from or what his purpose is. So I think that's an area where there needs to be a great deal of caution. You should kind of understand who owns the paper. You know Murdoch owns the paper. You kind of understand what that's all about. One of the big problems in that's happening that we see across the United States, and a major reason why I wanted to include the Las Vegas Review-Journal in this film, is that the financial underpinnings of news has fallen off a cliff, basically, and a lot of that is because of social media and other platforms have kind of stolen all of the kind of basic the funding for these things. And so across the United States, in city after city after city where there used to be competing newspapers, big publications that actually competed for the attention and tried to outdo each other in a really healthy kind of ecosystem, that has eroded over time, and especially in the last few years, so that leaving a lot of big cities without a strong watchdog journalism. And when it's a classic sort of situation that people do bad things to each other, but it's worse where everybody's in the dark. And so we're left with pockets whereas it's often pointed out that the New York Times or the Washington Post is doing really well kind of in the Trump era. Lots of people are subscribing to it. They're finding new forms of revenue. Not true with local news, and I think it's leaving a real gap in the United States. So as certainly it'll continue to have very rich people coming in to buy papers. That's just going to keep happening, but we have to watch and question their motives as well. I mean, I think the Washington Post with Jeff Bezos it's important to see how does the Washington Post cover Amazon, for instance. You have to kind of keep questioning that stuff. But I think we're to some degree uncharted territory as the whole ground beneath us shifts.
Not all billionaires are the same. Some of them own media because they want to do the right thing, to present viewpoints, to have influence, certainly, but to limit that influence to the editorial pages and the opinion pages. Others, not so much. They have other business interests that they're pushing. They have personal scores to settle. They have political agendas. It's less how much money someone has than what outside influences they bring and what their attitude is. At one point, if you had an individual owner of a newspaper, it could go either way. You could have a bad one, but you could also have a good one. But you knew where they were coming from because primarily their fortune was tied to the fortune of the newspaper. What we're seeing now is people who have made fortunes in other lines of work, who have other businesses are now buying up media and then changing the focus of the media. If what Sheldon Adelson did, people asked, well, why would he buy a local newspaper, a man with global ambitions and a global agenda? Why would he buy a local newspaper in Las Vegas, of all places? My theory, and this is just a theory, is that it wasn't so much to push his agenda as it was to take 110 journalists off the boards from covering what he was doing. We reported things about him, about his empire that he didn't like. This stopped that.
So that again is an example of a different way of controlling the media, and that again is a green light to other wealthy businessmen or people involved in illegal activities on how to control us.
Correct.
Any more questions?
Good afternoon.
Yes.
My question is on the relevance of statistics and the false illusion that it paints in a country like ours. A little while ago, you conducted a little poll in this room about how many people knew the Hindi word for privacy. But in a country where 85% of the people live in a single room, and the kitchen, the drawing room, the dining room, the bedroom is the same room, including the washroom for the women. How relevant is that poll? And while this looks like a nice full hall, the 15% who do have some kind of privacy, how relevant are they? They're not relevant politically, they're not relevant economically, because they don't pay any tax. So this dangerous illusion of a poll or a statistic that creates a picture or illusion we really can't use or apply.
This reality is on us, around us all the time. It doesn't preclude that we discuss it in a different privacy, in a different context also. You, in some way, are going back to the argument that I've been hearing since the 60s and 70s. Yes, I'm old enough that I started doing journalism in 1971. So at that time when we used to go out in the villages or come back, and the constant refrain was, it's all very well for you to sit there and stand here in an air-conditioned room drinking whiskey, which I never drank, and writing these kind of articles or making these kind of comments. What you're saying comes from that world. So I acknowledge, nobody denies that. It doesn't change anything. The context that we're talking about is privacy important to people in India? No, it isn't in the context that you're saying, because there are other priorities. That's all. James, either way.
Yeah.
Nothing really to add.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Actually, you provoked me a little bit. It's a bit like if we're talking about, there have been panels on many different subjects, and we've talked about the Me Too movement, and then somebody will get up and say, it's all very well for you to talk about the Me Too movement in your offices where you have options to go to the police and go to women's groups and go to the National Commission of Women. What about the women who have been picked up in villages by the Thakurs for centuries? Why don't you talk about that? Okay, we go to another subject. The same rules apply in all of it. So don't forget that when we're talking about elite, we are the elite, we're talking about these issues, and we have also talked about issues in which we, as journalists, have to make efforts to be the voices and take those stories from citizen journalists and other people who post those stories, take them forward, investigate them, bring out the nuances and investigate them for what is true and what is not, and be the intermediaries to readers or viewers so that those stories are told to people which are normally not told by mainstream media.
My question is that, to a large extent, the First Amendment in the United States and in the Indian Constitution, the law is developing or has been established to some extent on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, the rights of the press. I mean, it's a work in progress. We can say that in India it's up and down, like in any society. Even in the United States, under Trump, you may expect some setbacks. But now there is another, and as James pointed out, the world of the printed newspaper has experienced a huge shifting of the ground. Now, as we go more and more online, will these rules need to be re-established, or are we in more danger online than we are in print? Because we have a tradition in print of fighting for these things, and we have established case law. So my question is, what are your views of the online freedom and the threat to that?
Freedom of speech is freedom of speech, whether it's individually, whether it's us talking today, or whether it's written down and disseminated in some way. The rules are the same online as they are in person. The difference is, online, it's a different atmosphere. The words go everywhere, and it's more of a free-for-all. But the bottom line is, you still are responsible for what you say. You can still be held liable. And it just hasn't really been fully tested yet because it's still a new medium. Frankly, the medium doesn't change. The philosophy is the same.
I think there are some new elements that we're dealing with when you talk about online speech. And,
Ordinary people are being put in jail for Facebook.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big deal. To what degree? Yeah, and I think the other things part of what we're struggling with a lot too is, there's a big talk right now in the United States about hate speech. How far can something go? And if you're engaged in kind of hate speech online, what are and some of that speech is actually being artificially boosted by bots and other entities. To what degree should we try to control those? And of course, the main issue of speech, one of the main issues of speech online, is that a lot of these are forums and platforms for speech, for news, for anything, any kind of expression, are now private companies. And there is no freedom of expression or freedom of First Amendment Act. There's no protection. They get to kick you off for whatever reason they want. And so this has been upsetting in the United States to people who are both liberal and conservative. There's been a big outcry in conservative circles about deplatforming, about people that are so upset about speech that they're kicked off of Twitter, they're kicked off of Facebook. So this is a big question when a handful of companies, really, YouTube and others, where they're trying to be mainstream companies. They don't want to be too extreme with speech, so they're being put in the position of being, in some ways, government regulating. What was once in the hands of the government is now in their hands to decide what is appropriate speech. I think this is a big deal that we have to think about and solve moving forward.
The last time, previous Minister of Information and Broadcasting tried to regulate the internet space, and because there was such an outrage, the next morning Narendra Modi didn't take more than 12 hours to withdraw it. And as of now, they do not have a policy to control us, but there are enough in place which can be pulled out whenever necessary, as you see that happens. So it's a struggle, and our time is up. So I thank you, Brian and James. It was absolutely wonderful to hear both your positions on everything that you've shown. Congratulations on your film. Congratulations on your investigative work. I wish you all the best for more, and hope there'll be some collaboration between India and your organization, between Newslaundry, and all the best to you, Brian. Thank you very much, and many more films. And please, all of you, if you haven't seen it, please go see Nobody Speak, and also the Aaron Swartz one, which I found was just devastating. Thank you.